The world just crossed a threshold that most people assumed would never be reached outside of a Tom Clancy novel. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States military has elevated its defense readiness condition to DEFCON 3, a posture that places nuclear forces on increased alert, begins the dispersal of strategic bomber assets to forward operating locations, and initiates command post activation procedures that have not been fully executed in over 60 years. The trigger for this elevation was not ambiguous. Russian President Vladimir Putin formally activated updated provisions of Russia's nuclear doctrine, changes that lower the threshold for nuclear weapons employment in ways that fundamentally alter the strategic calculation that has kept the nuclear peace since 1945. In my 30 years of analyzing great power competition and nuclear strategy, I have sat through plenty of moments of tension that were billed as dangerous, but proved on closer examination to be manageable within the existing frameworks. This is not one of those moments. What Putin activated yesterday is not a bluff, not a negotiating gambit, and not an empty threat manufactured for domestic political consumption. It is a formal revision to the operational doctrine that governs how and when Russia would employ its strategic nuclear arsenal. And the specific language of that revision strips away several layers of ambiguity that previously sat between conventional conflict and nuclear escalation. The American response, elevating to DEFCON 3 across all unified combatant commands, repositioning ballistic missile submarines, and activating the airborne command posts that would direct nuclear operations in a decapitation scenario, is not theater. It is the operational expression of a strategic community that has read the current threat environment and concluded that the risk of miscalculation has climbed to a level where the nuclear command and control apparatus needs to shift from peacetime posture to a state of heightened readiness. When both sides of a nuclear standoff start moving their pieces into positions that compress decision time and amplify the consequences of error, the world is not on edge. The world is on a knife edge, and what happens next will be determined by decisions made under time pressure by human beings operating with incomplete information and the weight of civilizational survival resting on their judgment. In the analysis ahead, we will work through 3 questions that every person watching this escalation needs answered. What exactly did Putin activate inside Russia's nuclear doctrine? Why does it lower the threshold for nuclear use? And what does the specific language tell us about the scenarios Russia is now prepared to meet with strategic weapons? Why did the United States elevate to DEFCON 3? What is the threat assessment that drove that decision? And what does DEFCON 3 operationally mean for the posture and readiness of American nuclear forces? And the question that matters most, where does this go from here? What are the paths back from the edge? And what happens if the de-escalation paths fail? If you value analysis that goes beyond the headlines and into the strategic reality that shapes these events, subscribe and stay with me. Share this with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening right now. Leave your assessment in the comments. Now let us get into it. The document Putin signed into activation yesterday has been in development for more than 18 months, and its contents have been the subject of sustained analysis inside the Western strategic community ever since draft language began circulating through restricted channels earlier this year. What makes this revision operationally significant is not that it introduces entirely new concepts. The basic framework of Russian nuclear doctrine has been publicly articulated for years, but that it formalizes and lowers the thresholds for several specific employment scenarios that were previously described in more ambiguous terms. The core of Russia's nuclear doctrine, as it stood before this revision, rested on 2 pillars. The first was the right to employ nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack against Russia or its allies. The second was the right to employ nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack that threatened the existence of the Russian state. Both of those pillars remain in the revised doctrine. What has changed is the operational definition of what constitutes a threat to the existence of the state, and the inclusion of specific scenarios that now explicitly sit inside the threshold for potential nuclear response. The first major revision deals with attacks on Russian nuclear command and control infrastructure. The new doctrine explicitly states that an attack using conventional weapons against the early warning systems, command posts, or communications infrastructure that supports Russia's nuclear forces will be treated as equivalent to a nuclear attack and will authorize a nuclear response. This is not a subtle shift. It means that a conventional cruise missile strike against a Russian radar installation, or a cyber attack that degrades the functionality of Russia's nuclear command system, can now, under the revised doctrine, legally justify a strategic nuclear response under Russian military law. The second major revision concerns the aggregation of conventional threats. The doctrine now contains language stating that a large-scale conventional attack using precision weapons, drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles with conventional warheads, that threatens critical infrastructure or produces significant territorial losses can be treated as meeting the threshold for nuclear employment. The operational implication is that Russia is formally asserting the right to escalate to nuclear use not only in response to existential threats, but in response to large-scale conventional attacks it assesses as strategically destabilizing. The third revision, and this is the one that has the Pentagon most concerned, explicitly extends Russia's nuclear umbrella to cover Belarus and any other state with which Russia has a formal defense agreement. This language manufactures ambiguity around whether conventional attacks on Russian forces operating in support of allies could trigger nuclear escalation. The deliberate vagueness of that wording is, in my assessment, intentional, engineered to seed uncertainty in Western planning about where the actual red lines are drawn. From a strategic signaling standpoint, what Putin accomplished with this activation is a recalibration of the risk calculation NATO must run when considering any military action that could touch Russian strategic interests. Before this revision, NATO planners could operate with reasonable confidence that conventional military operations, even large-scale ones, would not trigger a nuclear response as long as they did not directly threaten Russian territory or the survival of the Russian state. That confidence is now gone. The Doctrine revision injects enough ambiguity that any significant conventional operation now carries a non-zero risk of nuclear escalation, and that risk has to be priced into every planning decision. The Defense Readiness Condition System, DEFCON, is a 5-tier alert posture framework that defines the readiness state of the United States military, with particular emphasis on nuclear forces and the command structure that would direct them in conflict. DEFCON 5 is normal peacetime readiness. DEFCON 1 is maximum force readiness with nuclear war either imminent or already underway. DEFCON 3, where the United States currently sits, is the midpoint, and it represents a level of readiness that has not been activated across the entire military since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. What DEFCON 3 operationally means is specific and observable. Strategic bomber forces, the B-52, B-2, and B-1 fleets, begin dispersal operations from their primary bases to forward operating locations and austere airfields that provide geographic distribution and survivability against a first strike. That dispersal has already begun. Open-source flight tracking confirmed B-52 movements out of Barksdale Air Force Base to forward locations within hours of the DEFCON elevation. The Ballistic Missile Submarine Force, which operates on continuous patrol cycles under normal conditions, increases its at-sea presence and repositions boats into launch baskets that optimize coverage of priority target sets. The ICBM Force, which remains on continuous alert regardless of DEFCON level, raises the manning of its launch control centers and runs readiness drills at higher frequency. The National Military Command Center and its alternate facilities transition from normal operations to continuous 24-hour battle staff manning. The E-4B Night Watch and E-6B Mercury Airborne Command Posts, the aircraft designed to provide command and control of nuclear forces if ground-based infrastructure is destroyed, raise their alert posture and conduct more frequent airborne operations. Communication checks between the National Command Authority and the operational commanders who would execute nuclear strike orders increase in frequency. Intelligence collection against Russian nuclear forces intensifies to provide early warning of any changes in their posture that could indicate preparation for nuclear use. What DEFCON 3 does not mean is that nuclear war is imminent or inevitable. It means that the assessment of the strategic environment has climbed to a level where the time available for decision-making in a crisis could be compressed to a point that requires the command and control system to be postured for rapid execution. DEFCON 3 is built to preserve options and protect decision space for national leadership, to ensure that if a crisis escalates rapidly, the infrastructure required to respond is already in place and does not have to be stood up under emergency conditions with all the error risk that entails. Having observed how these systems run, what concerns me most about the current DEFCON 3 posture is not the readiness of the systems themselves. Those systems are designed for exactly this scenario, and they function as intended. What concerns me is the human dimension of operating at this alert level for an extended stretch. Nuclear command and control is ultimately executed by human beings who must make judgment calls under time pressure with incomplete information. The longer the system operates at heightened alert, the greater the cumulative fatigue, the higher the risk of misreading ambiguous signals, and the more compressed the decision timeline becomes if an actual crisis emerges. DEFCON 3 is sustainable for weeks to months, but it is not without cost, and that cost climbs with duration. The question that matters for assessing where this goes next is not what Putin activated or how the United States responded in isolation. It is how the interaction between those two moves creates a dynamic that neither side fully controls. This is what strategists call an escalation spiral, a process in which each side's actions, taken individually for defensive or deterrent purposes, collectively produce a security environment less stable and more dangerous than what existed before either side acted. Putin's activation of the revised nuclear doctrine was framed in Moscow as a defensive measure, a response to what Russia characterizes as increasingly aggressive NATO posturing near Russian borders and the provision of long-range precision weapons to Ukraine that could be used to strike deep into Russian territory. From the Kremlin's perspective, lowering the nuclear threshold is a deterrent signal designed to load costs and risks onto Western decision-making that will discourage actions Russia views as unacceptably escalatory. That logic is internally coherent from a Russian strategic perspective. The American elevation to DEFCON 3 was framed in Washington as a prudent force protection measure, a response to the increased ambiguity in Russian nuclear doctrine that requires the U.S. nuclear command structure to be postured to respond rapidly if the situation deteriorates further. From the Pentagon's perspective, moving to DEFCON 3 lowers the risk of being caught flat-footed if Russia's doctrine revision is a precursor to actual nuclear employment. That logic is internally coherent from an American strategic perspective. The problem is that both of those internally coherent defensive moves, when executed simultaneously, produce an aggregate effect that is destabilizing rather than stabilizing. Russia reads the American DEFCON elevation as confirmation that NATO is preparing for a larger confrontation, which validates the threat perception that motivated the doctrine revision in the first place. The United States reads Russia's doctrine revision as an indication that Moscow is willing to employ nuclear weapons at a lower threshold than previously understood, which validates the threat assessment that motivated the DEFCON elevation. Each side's defensive move becomes evidence supporting the other side's threat perception. That is the structure of a spiral, and it is extraordinarily difficult to arrest once it begins. What makes this spiral particularly dangerous is the involvement of third parties, whose actions neither Moscow nor Washington fully controls. Ukraine continues to conduct military operations using Western-supplied weapon systems, some of which have ranges that extend into Russian territory. Israel and Iran are locked in a separate but intersecting confrontation that ties in Russian interests through Moscow's relationship with Tehran and American interests through Washington's commitment to Israeli security. Any escalation in either of those theaters has the potential to trigger responses that feed back into the U.S.-Russia dynamic in ways that compress decision time and increase the risk of miscalculation. I have studied enough Cold War history to know that nuclear crises are not resolved through the operation of impersonal strategic logic. They are resolved through direct communication between senior leadership, mutual recognition that neither side benefits from continued escalation, and the construction of off-ramps that let both sides step back without appearing to capitulate. That process requires time, diplomatic bandwidth, and a degree of trust that neither side will exploit a de-escalation gesture as an opportunity for advantage. In the current environment, all three of those prerequisites are in short supply. The question every serious observer should be asking right now is not whether this situation is dangerous, it obviously is, but whether there are viable paths back from the edge that both sides could take without giving up core interests. Having worked through this problem from multiple angles, my assessment is that de-escalation is possible, but it will require decisions that neither leadership structure is currently positioned to make easily. For Russia, stepping back would require some form of assurance that NATO will not exploit the current situation to advance positions Moscow views as unacceptable, continued expansion of long-range strike capabilities provided to Ukraine, forward deployment of additional NATO forces to the eastern flank, or moves toward formal Ukrainian NATO membership. Moscow would need to be able to frame any de-escalation as having achieved its deterrent objective, that the doctrine revision successfully imposed costs on Western planning and locked in commitments that reduce the threat to Russian strategic interests. That narrative requirement is not trivial, and it constrains the flexibility Putin has to simply reverse course. For the United States, stepping back would require confidence that Russia's doctrine revision is not a precursor to actual nuclear employment, and that lowering the DEFCON posture would not leave American forces unprepared for a rapid escalation scenario. Washington would need some form of assurance, likely through direct leadership communication or through observable changes in Russian nuclear force posture, that the immediate crisis has stabilized. The domestic political environment inside the United States also constrains flexibility because any move that can be portrayed as weakness in the face of Russian nuclear threats carries significant political cost. The most likely path to de-escalation, in my judgment, runs through direct presidential-level communication and the establishment of mutual commitments that neither side will take actions the other has identified as red lines during a defined stabilization period. This is not arms control in the formal sense. That process takes years, and this situation requires resolution in weeks. This is crisis management through direct dialogue and the construction of interim understandings that open space for longer-term diplomatic work. The challenge is that the current state of US-Russia relations is the worst it has been since the Cold War. The communication channels that operated during that earlier period have atrophied, and the domestic political environments in both countries create incentives for firmness rather than flexibility. Those are not insurmountable obstacles, but they are real constraints that make the de-escalation path narrow and difficult to navigate. I do not engage in catastrophism for its own sake, but honest analysis requires confronting scenarios that are uncomfortable to think about. If the current escalation spiral continues without successful intervention, there are pathways to outcomes that no rational actor on either side desires, but that could emerge from the interaction of defensive moves, misperception, and time pressure. The scenario that concerns me most is not deliberate nuclear war. Neither leadership wants that outcome, and both grasp the consequences. What concerns me is inadvertent escalation driven by the misinterpretation of ambiguous events during a period of heightened alert when both sides' nuclear forces are at increased readiness. The time available to assess an ambiguous warning and judge whether it represents an actual attack or a false alarm is compressed. The incentive to launch on warning rather than risk absorbing a first strike rises. The probability that a technical failure, a misidentified event, or a localized military action gets read as something larger and triggers a response neither side intended climbs. The historical record contains multiple instances where nuclear war was averted by individuals who made correct judgment calls under extreme pressure in circumstances where the available information was ambiguous. Stanislav Petrov in 1983, who correctly read a satellite false alarm as not being an American attack. Multiple submarine commanders during the Cuban Missile Crisis who chose not to authorize the use of nuclear torpedoes despite being out of communication and operating under rules of engagement that technically permitted it. Those were individual human judgments made correctly. The current environment creates more opportunities for those judgments to be required, and the probability that all of them continue to be made correctly indefinitely is not 100%. The other scenario that warrants attention is the possibility that a conventional conflict in a theater where both Russian and American interests are engaged, whether in Ukraine, the Middle East, or elsewhere, produces a direct military engagement between Russian and American forces that neither side initially intended to escalate, but that proves difficult to contain once it begins. The revised Russian nuclear doctrine creates pathways where conventional conflict could transition to nuclear threats at thresholds lower than previously existed. Once nuclear threats are explicitly on the table, the pressure to demonstrate resolve rises and the pathways to de-escalation narrow. I want to be clear that I am not predicting nuclear war. I am describing risk levels and escalation pathways that currently exist and that require active management to keep from being traveled. The existence of risk does not guarantee bad outcomes, but it does demand that the people responsible for managing that risk understand its nature and take it seriously. In a career spent studying how great powers interact under conditions of strategic competition, I have never seen a moment where the nuclear dimension of that competition shifted from background condition to active operational variable as rapidly as it has in the past 72 hours. Putin's activation of Russia's revised nuclear doctrine and America's elevation to DEFCON 3 are not reversible with a press release. They are changes to the strategic environment that will persist until deliberate action is taken to de-escalate them. And that action is not currently visible. What happens next depends on decisions that will be made in Moscow, Washington, and potentially other capitals over the coming days and weeks. Those decisions will be made under time pressure with incomplete information by human beings operating under stress. The margin for error is smaller than it has been in decades. That should concern everyone. The question I want to leave you with: do you assess the current leadership structures in Moscow and Washington as capable of managing this crisis back from the edge? Or do you believe the structural incentives and domestic political constraints both sides operate under make continued escalation more likely than successful de-escalation? That assessment matters because it shapes what happens next. Leave your assessment in the comments. If this analysis provided value, share it and subscribe for continuing coverage as this situation develops. Stay with me.